Venice between Byzantium, International Gothic, and the emerging Renaissance, Bellini's synthesis. So the focus of this talk is, in fact, on Bellini, his synthesis, and setting up the framework for better understanding that. So the key word here, the operative word, is between. In fact, that is the very definition of what makes Venice exotic, unique, particular, is the way it negotiated its various poles, that it created a viable and in fact prosperous realm out of being between all these various realms, of course including, as it emerged in the 15th and 16th century, the resurgent Islamic empire in the West, the so-called Ottoman Empire. So there's a preview of where we're heading, and then some nice paintings. This is Luca Carlevaris, a predecessor and in fact a teacher of Canaletto's. So the whole Vedute manner that will be our culminating lecture, in other words, the city as the focus of works of art, or the city as a work of art, really begins with Luca, and Canaletto is his most precocious and brilliant follower. But what I love about this painting, unlike Canaletto's, this painting is much more full of foreground elements, namely all these boats and the whole range of boats, from the Doge's great barge to the back of a galley in this corner to a galleon in this corner. This is much more a authentic image of Venice as an incredibly busy port and place of mercantile and cultural exchange. And these next images are from the late 19th century, probably the 1880s. Venice, as it is now, a place of tourism and still fascinating in its strange limbo as a museum city. It's based on an article. The article was called "How Venice Looked to Victorian Travelers in the 1880s." So this is to preview that on Friday at 5:30 we're going to see a film set in Venice in the 1950s, also a distant time now, entitled Summertime, with the inimitable Katharine Hepburn as the other star. Venice, of course, is the principal star. So very archaic looking boats. These are views from, this is pre-airplane, so these are views from the Campanile of St. Mark's, overlooking the city. Better dressed people in the Campanile, but the pigeons were already there. A glimpse of the interior of St. Mark's. We've spent a bit of time there. More eye-level views, close-ups, all very exotic, classic views. Do you see how the tower is leaning slightly to the left and has a curve to it, right? Okay, here is a classic view by Canaletto from the 18th century. Optically, it's clear it's not based on a photograph, on a lens, because if you compare the proportions with the previous image, the tower is bigger, fatter, taller, more dominant. Canaletto makes it shorter, slender. He foregrounds the framing buildings. And this was some sort of public event that this photograph captures in the 1880s. And then in 1902, on the evening of July 14th, fortunately at night, I believe only one sad little cat was the casualty. Miraculously, it just fell down on itself, and well, it took out a corner of the Sansovino's library and pulverized Sansovino's loggia. But other than that, of course, it was a big shock. There were some anticipatory signs, i.e. cracks suddenly began to appear in the days before the collapse. Here's a close-up. And 10 years later, on public subscriptions, it was rebuilt. So it was inaugurated in 1912 as a replica of itself on somewhat firmer foundations. These are all colored black and white pictures, by the way, from the late 19th century. It purports to be moonlight, but obviously it was taken at daylight. There wouldn't have been that many people hanging around. This is the view from inside the Doge's Palace, looking at St. Giorgio, another classic view past the two honorific columns at the Salute, and then looking at the Salute from the Grand Canal. And then deep in the Grand Canal, notice you already have the precursors to the Vaporettos. Venice was already a very busy tourist city in the 19th century. And in fact, a classic novel of Henry James was written just about this time, The Wings of the Dove, which is a very beautiful story that's, a big part of it is set in Venice. Another view of a classic gondola with its gondolier and passenger and characteristic buildings. One of the more famous buildings from the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages on the canal. Some of the early Renaissance buildings seen through an earlier building. A close-up of that building by Mario Cadusi, a palazzo, a great palazzo by Longhena, one of the Lombardi miracles, a scola, a quiet, typical canal, a smaller piazza with afternoon business in the piazza. Of course, the public spaces were the living rooms of the city. Most people lived in tiny quarters, except for the very rich. Not that different from New York today. And a courtyard, actually not a slum, just a courtyard from an everyday part of the city. And then one of the great tragic losses because of World War I. Here's a photograph of Tiepolo's largest religious painting, which got hit with an Austrian shell in, I believe it was 1915. The Austrians were in the mountains just outside of Venice. The Italians foolishly entered the war because they were greedy and they wanted Trieste. One of the surviving portions of Tiepolo's work in this church is on the vault of the crossing, which miraculously survived. And we have two studies for the eventual ceiling. This is the earlier one, the more finished one. This is in the Accademia in Venice. It's one of his famous oil sketches. Quite a miracle for a sketch, I'm sure you'll agree. And then he rotated elements of the painting, and this is the starting point for what was eventually realized on the ceiling. And we really only have this one large format image that is the record of that ceiling. However, because it was still the earlier part of the century and people who were trained in the 19th century were still operating in the 1920s, this is a canvas reproduction, not of Tiepolo's, but a new composition to replace Tiepolo's ceiling by a painter, an Italian painter, Ettore Tito, and it was finished in the early 1930s. So a monumental painting from the 20th century. And there's a rare 18th century engraving which shows the overall design of Tiepolo's ceiling. So, back to betwixt and between. To remind you, the first, we see the painting in the corner, the first characteristically self-consciously Venetian painter was called Paul the Venetian, or Paolo Veneziano, early 14th century. This is one of his panels of a Madonna and Child from the circa 1325. And what we're going to do for the first third of today's lecture is explore what the elements of the betwixt and between that the Venetians were grappling with exactly were. And I'll just tell you, clearly International Gothic in this one. This is his larger complex painting, where you see elements of the International Gothic in the two central figures, but very deliberately traditional Byzantine style images in the framing elements, even in the way they're framed. And to set the contemporary framework, a little bit later, it's from 1333. This was a masterpiece of the emerging International Gothic from Siena by Simone Martini, an Annunciation. So the International Gothic is a synthesis of the emerging naturalism coming out of Italy, with much more traditional late Gothic painting and sculptural traditions coming out of Northern and Western Europe, namely France. So back to Paul the Venetian. This is a small portable altar, a triptych, where you see that in fact he's operating almost entirely within a traditional Byzantine iconography with touches of the new naturalism. So he oscillates quite dramatically between them. And here we have an example of a contemporary religious painting, an icon from Venice that, although it's mid-14th century, it could be 13th century and 12th century. It's completely traditional. Even the framework is traditionally Byzantine. Okay, so these changes are embodied very clearly in this, it's called Italo-Byzantine in the art historians. It's the Cambrai Madonna that ended up in France, and its origin was probably Sienese, where you see the naturalism of the figures combined with a completely Byzantine iconography. It's the type is Our Lady of Tenderness, and I'll show you some authentic Byzantine examples. This is one from the Southern Balkans, Our Lady of Mercy. 1350 is its date, so this is mainstream Byzantine work. So the naturalism is there already in the prototype, but it is a highly stylized naturalism. So yes, they are interested in particularity, individuality, portraits, but they're highly stylized. And in fact, the manner of stylization goes all the way back to Roman and Greek antiquity, for those of you who've begun to look at Pompeian wall painting and surviving. Fragments from the Byzantine world. This is its setting, the icon screen, the iconostas in the monastery of Deceni in today's Kosovo, which used to be southern Serbia. So here is the Our Lady of Tenderness. Another, this is from Mount Athos icon, a close-up, really very damaged. Mercifully, most of her face is intact. So I'm showing this, I hope you can see what I mean about the stylized naturalism. In other words, it's not schematic, it's not linear, it's not abstract, but it's very deliberately, well, they almost look like ancient Greek statues in a way. And even the highlights are done in a very traditional Roman fashion. The white on the, there you see it in the larger context. Another very, very beautiful icon. This is from Greece. Again, a little bit later in the 14th century. It's called the Virgin Car De Soto. And of course, all of these are tempera, gold leaf on wooden panels. So, different artists communicated a somewhat different character, but all within a very, very recognizable stylistic horizon. This is a more active Virgin of Tenderness, where the baby is more baby-like, and a masterpiece of a Byzantine artist who moved to Kiev, to the Russian realms, and is known as Theophanes the Greek. This is from late in the 14th century, showing different degrees of stylization. So, that's the tradition. This is what happens to the tradition when the naturalism that emerges in the early 14th century reaches the middle of the 15th century. And this is Mantegna. This is about 100 years after those earlier images. This is from the 1454. This is a severely damaged painting in the collection of the Met. The upper right-hand side of the painting, the surface has been severely abraded, so you're looking at the underpainting of the Madonna's, most of her face, and the angels on this side, but the Christ child and the angels on the left, and the limbs are better preserved. So this is a painting that we'll be able to see in ourselves directly. So Mantegna is an important figure for the rest of our story. You'll see why in a moment. So that was a Mantegna painting from earlier in his career. This is 2 decades later. Same painter, same subject. So something has been happening. That's what we're trying to get our fingers on. And here's his brother-in-law, the focus of the rest of our talk today. This is Bellini in the first third of his painterly career. Giovanni Bellini was a child of a family of painters. His father was a noted Venetian painter. He was, of course, born in Venice. His older brother was, in fact, a great painter of the Doges and painted many great rooms in the Doge's palace, which sadly were destroyed in the Great Fire of this later 15th century, which consumed the whole of the palace. So Bellini is known for many devotional paintings of the Madonna and Child, and this is one, Madonna with the Child blessing. It's again a Byzantine type. So, who began all this, or in fact, who first embodies this transformation from the late antique as it was embodied in East Rome and its cultural ecumen, and this new emerging art in the West. Of course, it's Giotto. And this is a painting in the National Gallery now in Washington, D.C., of around 1320 by Giotto and Madonna and Child. Typologically very Byzantine, but this desire to represent the more complete reality of how people actually are is very, well, I would say not slowly, very emphatically present, much more dramatic in his Arena Chapel and in his other frescoes, but even in the most traditional of settings, an icon very clear. And just to compare it with a contemporary Byzantine icon, the issue is degrees of stylization and how all this figures within a larger context of worship. More can be said. But nonetheless, these icons are a part of the everyday reality of Venetians much more than other Italians. Okay, another pivotal figure whose great opus, the date is in fact set in the year 1300, is Dante. And his influence in the trajectory of the 14th and 15th century should not be overlooked. This is Branzinos' great allegorical portrait of Dante, showing him between the Inferno. There he's touching an image of the Duomo in Florence. This is the Mountain of Purgatory and the light pointing to Paradiso. And in fact, he's open to the manuscript. His manuscript is open to Book 25 of the Paradiso, which is the canto on the theological meditation on hope. But, as you know, Dante begins, I think the evening before Easter Friday in the year 1300 is when his great poem is set, as he finds himself in a dark wood, lost, suddenly becomes self-conscious of the fact that he has lost his way, and that is the trajectory. Now, I'm not going to show you too many maps. This is Europe in the year 1300. The point of this map is its heterogeneity. In other words, just here's France and England, the two big players. In the early 14th century, in a decade or so, we have the beginning of the 100 Years' War between the English and the French. But look at Central Europe, especially Italy. Lots of bits and pieces. So as we zero in on northern Italy, what has happened? This would not have been true 100 years earlier. What has happened is the failure of empire for the third time in the West. The first time was the Frankish realm, the Merovingians, who suffered political cultural entropy and were replaced between 750 and 800 by the Carolingians. The Carolingian Empire only lasted for less than a century. It failed. It was replaced by the Ottonian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire proper. And it failed by the middle of the 13th century, which is to say by 1250. So by 1300, the consequences of this failure of empire is in fact this richness of small principalities, especially in central and northern Italy. And the dynamic there, as I've alluded to before, but is key to understanding how it is that the Renaissance comes into being, both in Venice and elsewhere, is that the political powers and the religious power were evenly balanced so that none could prevail over the others. And what that meant is that local centers had a chance to, first of all, develop as they did in the 13th century and really take off in the 14th and 15th century. So you had a plurality of centers, and it is the plurality of centers that is the agent of cultural, artistic change that gives us the miracle of the Renaissance. If the imperial power had maintained its control, you would have had only one center. So that is key. And remember, Venice is then between all these centers and its memory of and actuality of the East, both the Old East, the Old Roman East, and the New Islamic East. Now,
so none of them, in a way, like since it's no unified country, they're not paying taxes to the government, rather they're all self-contained.
yes, this is the emergence of all the small republics, including our Republic of Florence. Look at how small Florence is in 1300. This is the Florence that kicks Dante out, and Dante writes his great work as an exile, and he ends up dying and is buried in Ravenna in the northernmost limit of the Papal State. And even the Papal State is only directly ruled from Rome in its southern portion, southern third. These then become semi-independent principalities. The most famous are Urbino and Bologna, Rimini. So the local strongman. Yes, yeah, it's patronage. Patronage is diversified across many centers. And it's patronage between the local bishop and the local ruler. And these guys were all fighting each other. We're not talking about peace, but they're evenly balanced. And they, within them, you have, and this is why we go to Romeo and Juliet, the reconciliation of the Montagues and Capuets over the dead bodies of Romeo and Juliet. What Romeo and Juliet, the drama, is channeling is the internal dynamic in each one of these little republics, which is those people who swear their loyalty to the distant emperor, and those people who swear their loyalty to the distant pope. And the imperials come to be known as the Ghibellines, and the people who are loyal to the popes come to be known as the Guelphs. So, by the time you get to England in the late 16th century, this aspect of the story is largely forgotten, and so it becomes more a story of a struggle between two families. But the way they express their political, economic antagonism and desire to prevail over one of the other is by claiming allegiance to one of the two distant figures of authority. So, Florence ultimately became a papal city. Venice was an imperial city. That warred with the popes now and then. Okay, so that's the larger European context. Now we're going to glimpse at some Venetian architecture, the origins of Venetian public residential architecture as opposed to church architecture, and its origins are in the consequences very much of the Fourth Crusade. So this is emblematic. You've seen this picture of the capture of Constantinople. So the heirs to the Doge, who both engineered and profited from this enterprise, built a palazzo whose core largely survives. It's called the House of the Dandilos. That was the name of the Doge, and it sits on the Grand Canal. It's only the lower part, the lower two stories that are original, that are early 13th century, so around 1220s, 1230s. And it's the core of what will become the dominant palazzo type in Venice. And I show you these 19th century photographs because they show the original water level. As you'll see, the water level today is basically at floor level, but these buildings are actually built on a podium originally. They were not built at water level. So just these two stories. So this is one of the oldest on the Grand Canal, and you can see its type as it's carried forward. The upper stories were built in the 14th and 15th centuries. And the largest of these early palazzos is represented by this series of paintings from the early 18th century when it was better preserved, and they're important because they show us the crenellation of the central portion. It's still present in this painting. It was called in its last phase the Foundation of the Turks because it was the center of the Turkish ambassador in Venice. And the Turks really didn't take very good care of it, as you can see in the later 18th, 19th century. Another view of it as it decays. You can see there was actually a tower at this far end. And there is a early 19th century painting of it where the upper part is completely fallen apart and most of the marble revetment on the facade is fallen off, and it's just an abandoned building in the first half of the 18th century. And here's a first half of the 19th century. This is a mid-19th century photograph. It was almost demolished, and we have John Ruskin's a series of careful watercolors, studies of the remnants of the marble revetment on the facade, and then it was restored. It was restored with, let's just say, a heavy hand. They decided to make it all look brand new, so it's hard to tell the old pieces from the new pieces. In fact, it's virtually impossible because they sanded down the old marble revetment to make it brand new. And this is what it looks like today. Again, I took this picture because you notice the water level. There's actually a staircase going down to the water, which you don't see anymore. And this photograph from the 19th century is taken from within the colonnade, and you can see the top of the formal stair into the water. And there are two lovely paintings. This one shows the colonnade in the late period when it was occupied by the Turks. A rather charming image with lots of drapery and carpets and greenery. And then this wonderful reconstruction of its form as it was a palazzo in the 17th and early 18th century with the Doge coming to visit. It used to be the embassy, it used to be the place where different ambassadors were housed. So the Doge is coming to pay their respects to the representative of a major European power. Okay, the type. It's late Roman. Here's a reconstruction of Diocletian's palace in Spoleto on the Adriatic. There you see an aerial view of it. Even the corner towers are part of the type. And then these are reconstructions of the waterside palaces from Constantinople in elevation. And lastly, an archaeologically known palace from the center of the city of Constantinople. Here's an analytical cutaway perspective. Here are some archaeological plans of it. It was built, its podium was built on top of a huge late Roman rotunda, which provided the base for the cistern, and then the palazzo was built on top of it. And here's an elevation of it. So the Venetian palazzo type is Byzantine. And the oldest of these palazzos that's still extant on the Grand Canal is this one. It's called the Cadamosto. It's early 12th century. Sadly, it was recently renovated, so it's just not very much there to look at anymore. There's some close-ups of the marble revetment. You see the emergence of the Gothic OG over the Byzantine stilted arch. Arch on stilts is why it's called the stilted arch. Here's a 19th century photograph with the lower water level. A close-up before the restoration of the remaining marble revetment. There's John Ruskin's careful study of the remaining ornament, a watercolor, and another 19th century photograph. So we go from this to the early Gothic fairly directly. And the great masterpiece of the High Gothic in Venice is this building known as the Ca d'Oro, or the Golden House. And why was it called the Golden House? Because it was the home of a very rich family that gilded its ornament. In other words, gold leaf all over the house. None of it is left. A lot of it was still visible when John Ruskin carefully studied the building. And then it was restored with a somewhat less heavy hand, but nonetheless fairly heavy hand in the later 19th century. And they basically just sandpapered away the gold leaf. So it's called the Golden House, but there's no more gold leaf. Here's the other plan that I'm going to show you. There you see the Grand Canal. Here's the porch. There's a side canal, and you actually enter the living part of the house from the side canal. There are two courtyards, one here and one here. There's a gallery that connects the front to the courtyard, and from that you enter up into the Piano Nobile. The ground floor of these houses, just like the palazzi and the rest of Italy, was for business and storage. People, animals, people did not live on the ground floor. They lived on the floor above. The Piano Nobile, here's a photograph of that courtyard. It has a well. By the way, you may ask yourself, where did the Venetians get their water? From cisterns. They did not get their water from the canals. They would have all died out if that was the case. No. So each one of these buildings has a cistern, just like the Roman houses in Pompeii and Herculaneum have a cistern. And so they filtered their water and they boiled their water. They did not drink water out of the canals. The stair leading up to the Piano Nobile, a glimpse into that underground ground story, water story. And as the surviving tile floor, which goes back to the 15th, 14th, and 15th century. And looking at the front again. So, typologically, Byzantine, ornamentally, High Gothic, and there's a wonderful book which covers all this material. A little expensive, but I will borrow it from the library. Okay, a nice late 19th century photograph of it. The side canal was eventually built over in the 19th century and is now a road. And there's a water stop here today. There you see the stairs again leading up to the main story. A painting from the earlier part of the 20th century. And a nice painting from the 19th century of our building. So, the Gothic definitely arrived in Venice. The Venetians were certainly alive to everything that was current and new and fashionable, but nonetheless they appropriated it within their cultural horizons. So, what was the cutting edge in the early 15th century? Of course, was the Flemish style. And the great master of the Flemish style in the earlier part of the 15th century, one of the greatest, was of course Jan van Eyck. This is from his painting, now in Bruges, Belgium, of 1434. It was a part of a, right, okay, so I'll show you one other, a triptych by Jan van Eyck, the Dresden triptych. So this is a type that the Venetians will transform and make it their own, and this is what we will see in the work of the Bellinis, and namely John Bellini, Giovanni. So when the triptych is closed, the outer two panels are an Annunciation. This is a later version of that by Van Eyck, just showing how he developed the theme. So, the Flemish style is the high Renaissance version of International Gothic. So, its origins, nonetheless, in Venice are much more modest. So, starting with that modest beginning, Giovanni Bellini, by the 1470s, when he's in his maturity, produces his first undisputed masterpiece. This is the so-called Pizarro Altarpiece, because it's in Pizarro today. I think it was commissioned in Pizarro. So, frames, and frames within frames, and frames framing frames. Okay. Normally in the textbooks, this is what you see. You see how you lose the sense of the painting when you take the frame away? Yes, the center of the painting is wonderful. It's called a sacred conversation. That's actually a much more recent art historical term. You have a series of saints around the central figures, which are usually Christ, the Madonna with the Christ child. So, in this case, they're sitting on a throne, and the throne frames an image of the local setting, Pizarro. Okay, so you see the throne, the saints standing outside the throne. So in its origin, it is a triptych where the wings have been incorporated into the center, and above you have the Holy Spirit. So, you step back, you see what he's doing, right? He has designed the frame. On the frame, you have other saints, and you have a series of icons in the pedestal level of the frame. Then you have a perspectival view of a throne, which is formally architecturally related to the outer frame. If you take away the frame of the painting, you have mutilated the painting. And above you have another frame with a entombment scene, which the original is now in the Vatican, so you won't see it in Pizarro. This is a photo montage that reconstructs the whole of it. That's what you see in the museum in Pizarro. So, a masterpiece. I mentioned his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law was Mantegna. So, he is definitely alive to Mantegna's work and is influenced by Mantegna's work. And this is the great altarpiece in the Basilica of St. Zeno in Verona by Mantegna. Verona was a part of the land territories of Venice at this point, so it's within the Venetian sphere of influence, but Mantegna, although he certainly visited Florence, was largely lived on the mainland. There's the center of Mantegna's great painting, which again is the unity of the architecture, the altar frame with the inner painting. And you see how in his case, this is a courtyard, a peristyle, in the center of which the Madonna is, and the outer wooden frame of the altar is a part of the pictorial drama of the painting. So, this is much more in the direct manner of a triptych, where the unity is inside the painting between the panels. Just some close-ups. We have to speed up here. Now, this type was beginning to emerge even in central Italy, and this is considered to be the first unified triptych by a fellow by the name of Domenico Veneziano, born in Venice, but spent most of his career in Florence, and this is his painting from 1445. So it's a larger central Italian pictorial tendency that nonetheless in Venice and northern Italy that'll make it their own, as you'll see. So there's the setting for Mantegna's great painting, and this is the second of these great altarpieces by Giovanni Bellini. This is in the Church of San Giovanni and Paolo in Venice, where it's a series of paintings within a very gilded, spectacular frame. So more like the Mantegna. There we look at the Entombment at the top, the priest's eye view, a more elevational view, and here you see where it is. By the way, this talk is on the computer, so you're all welcome to spend more time with these images because it's a school computer. So it's right here in the basilica. This church replaced St. Mark's as the place where the late medieval and early Renaissance doges were buried. So they have something like 25 doges buried here. Okay, so the third of these great altarpieces is the only other one which is intact. This is in the Frari, the other great Gothic church that the Franciscans, it was the home of the Franciscans in Venice. Madonna enthroned between two saints, so it's another triptych, where the center is more prominent, and in fact the Madonna is sitting in an apse, and the whole thing alludes to a basilican church, a late antique basilican type. There we're looking at the Madonna, and she's very much an icon, okay? I'm giving the story away here. There are these cherubim musicians at the base. The inscription in the dome. We see the framing saints. And then it's setting within the sacristy chapel of the Franciscan Church, the Church of the Friars. So this is in its original setting, and it's actually intact. The last two masterpieces, sadly, no longer intact. This is the one in the Accademia. There you see it on its wall. It's been wrenched out of its frame along with its partners. These three stood in the same church of San Giobbe, and the church is still standing, but its altarpieces are now in the Accademia. Just to show you that the central image is also a part of a tradition. This is Piero della Francesca, about 2 decades earlier, from 1472, his famous altarpiece for the funeral chapel of the Dukes of Urbino. On this side you see what survives in the art gallery in Milan, and this is a reconstruction of the complete painting, which was cut down. This is, by the way, an art historical term. They call it being cut down. And as it became a work of art in the 18th century. So back to our great unified image. The whole is now within a barrel vault. It's still on its wooden surface, and here is a photo reproduction of it within the surviving frame in the church that it was originally painted for. You see how you destroy the work of art by taking its frame away, especially if it's an altarpiece by Giovanni Bellini, because this architecture is carried through into the heart of the painting. It becomes a trompe l'oeil that's very compressed spatially, and yet deep at the same time. So we'll look at it a little bit more closely. The Madonna is sitting on the throne of Solomon in this case. It's an elaborate throne. and it's very much iconic, quite spectacular. The images are deeply contemplative. The liveliest guys are the musicians, which are kind of looking around and concentrating on making music. Notice the marble revetment, straight out of late antique Byzantine architecture, the mosaics in the semi-dome, the coffering in the ceiling, and of course I'm gliding over the beautiful coloristic compositional qualities of it, the inscription in Latin. So it's going to ask me at the very end, because you'll see with his final paintings how he negotiates it. So don't you think they should, at least if they're going to keep it in the gallery, do a nice duplicate of its original frame? It makes no sense outside of its frame. Now this one is in the final altar masterwork that we're looking at in some detail is in the Church of St. Zachary. It's still in its original setting, but it was mutilated by the French. They cut it down and they took it to Paris and eventually came back. So its center, this is how you meet it in the art history books. It should be restored. This is what it looks like today. It's a very large painting, and it's very much his masterpiece. There you see it in its complete setting, in the setting of the church. There is the church itself, which is a lovely church. So now, that Bellini is Bellini and his imitators jump out at you as not having his artistic, painterly compositional control can be shown as those of his contemporaries who try to do Bellini-like paintings, which are fine in and of themselves, but notice immediately that this is a one-point perspective, and the figures are being pulled into the space, and the poor Madonna is being pushed back into the background. So remember my talk last semester about perspectival space in relation to Michelangelo? It's all there. So Bellini is avoiding the pitfalls of perspectival realism by giving us the illusion of perspectival realism. Here's another painting contemporary with Bellini's that is even more dramatically one-point realistic, and this is what happens when you put the Madonna in an actual apse. Yes? I will return to the Bellini. Yes, so let's look back at the Bellini. So it does look like she's way back there, but he has various strategies. In fact, these guys are in a compressed space that is not actually within the architectural space of the frame. Do you begin to see that? She's actually sitting more forward than she would be if she was in this actual apse. He's also created what looks like a semicircle, and it's actually an oval. Yes, he's flattened it. Yes, compression of space. And all these figures operate like they're almost within a frieze, independent of compositionally of the architectural frame that they're inside. Yes, exactly. There is, right. That's how you do it. Multiple vanishing points. But that are elided in such a way, and this knowledge was with us for many, many centuries, and it's very much the heart of Escher's sleight of hand with his impossible perspectives. So if you want to have a beginning into it has everything to do with adjacencies and creating virtual natural relationships which compress relationships across the painting which are not homogeneous. And of course, Bellini is the first great Venetian painter to paint to begin to paint entirely in oils, to use glazes. He was a master colorist, and he makes it all look effortless. So it is just a symphony of form and color and composition. And it needs to be restored to what it really once was. And then more than anything, a deeply religious man, and what is so characteristic of his work is the deep inwardness of the figures, the contemplative quality of all the figures. There's a glimpse of the semidome. This is actually an oil lamp with a crystal bottom where the oil is. So that's what remains of the painting. And when we step back, okay, you see, they cut it down. They turned it into an almost rectangle. There's nothing that stops us from restoring that vault. All the information is there. Why is it important? Because it wasn't just painted for this frame. This frame itself exists within the frame of the church, and you see how this vault is actually echoing the cross-groin vault above it in the church itself. So it just hurts my eyes to see that empty space. And not only that, but Bellini's, all his paintings are set on a parapet, like on a ledge. And so the French also cut off the bottom of the painting as well. We know this from others of his paintings which have that ledge. So this is the frame of the painting. It is the aesthetic frame of the painting. Frames are important. Lovely as the heart of the painting is, it's only a fragment. It's intelligible ultimately only in its full artistic context. So this is now the coda. Let's look at a few of Bellini's other paintings. This is his contribution to a series of painted friezes, reminding us of friezes as the heart of this understanding of pictorial space. This is a very enigmatic painting by Bellini, a late painting of his, which nobody really understands what it means. There's lots of speculation, but we can recognize some important figures by what they hold. This is St. Paul. This is St. Peter. They're standing outside of this fence. There's St. Sebastian. I'm not sure who this is. And you have these 4 children, the little tree, and there's no doubt that the lady under the canopy is in fact the Madonna between 2 saints within this enigmatic lake and landscape. So it's an allegorical painting. What the allegory is, we don't know. But again, Bellini's sleight of hand is, notice how he shifts the one-point perspective. He does not make the fatal mistake of making the center of the painting here. And in fact, the landscape is a super compressed spatial entity that makes everything have this telephoto quality. There's the gate that connects this enclosure with the outer realm. And you have this urn and this child. So nobody knows what it means. There's no text. Okay, another Bellini painting where the frame is in fact curtains. That was the other thing he liked to do. And he creates very much a similar this compositional disposition. See, the musicians are now in the background. Madonna is very much in the foreground, but the triptych quality of the composition is still there, and you have the opening up of the space on either side, and she sits under a canopy, and this is the fabulous original High Renaissance frame that this devotional image sits within. It was commissioned by this Doge who succeeded his brother. It was commissioned by the brother of this Doge who succeeded him, so it commemorates his predecessor. And then finally, some of his late paintings. This is a spectacular Madonna and Child between St. Catherine and St. Madeline. So you can see, we are now in the Venetian High Renaissance. It's very hard to get a good image of this painting because it's too dark. This is a snapshot from Flickr where you can see the background. There is actually a background. It's not black. What it is, it's a folded tapestry, and the lines are the remnants of the folds. Remember I showed you the folds in the garment that the little bronze statue in the Roman gallery preserves? Fabric used to be kept in cedar chests, folded, and then set up so you would see the folds. Okay, so this final type that we'll look at is the Entombment, which is again a Byzantine type. This is Bellini's work, is an earlier one from the 1460s, which is very much in the more agitated, emotional, anguish manner of international Gothic. And of course, this is another East Roman tradition. I'll show you a couple of icons. This one is a surviving one, badly preserved from the 12th century. Here we see Paolo Veneziano, his great altar icon for St. Mark's. Again, the center, the Christ entombed. That was what once was the everyday facade to what this was the festival image on the high altar. That was last week. A later Byzantine version with angels, which then Bellini channels into this wonderful late around 1480. So late in his career, as he begins to appropriate the naturalism of the high Renaissance within a nonetheless devotional Byzantine horizon. Okay, I hope you're all seeing that. The high Renaissance naturalism is subordinate to the worship that is characteristic of the Venetians, which is very much an East Roman piety. And his work miraculously is a synthesis of these traditions. And this is very clear in this fabulous painting. Pardon? Well, first of all, I'm getting to this is my conclusion. Bellini lived for a very long time. He died in his 88th year. So his life spans the early Renaissance to the high Renaissance. And so all of these traditions, when you get a book on Bellini, the work looks very heterogeneous because it's chronologically spread over more than 60 years. So you see the development of his style, but what I'm focusing on is the synthesis. So for example, this portrait of a Doge from around 1501, so in the last decade of his life. Remember, this is contemporary with Leonardo da Vinci, with early Raphael. We're in the threshold of the high Renaissance, but it's a very Venetian take. So the iconic qualities of the tradition are interpreted in a more dramatically naturalistic form, but they nonetheless remain very iconic. In other words, there is a stylization of naturalism. And the tendency and the tradition of stylization is the Roman, East Roman, Byzantine inheritance. And the discipline of his art combined with his artistic genius, and also remember, this comes together with he is a pioneer in using oils, using glazes, and he's a master of color as well as composition. So he brings all of these things together. Here's a late Madonna. I try to find as many of these images within an actual frame. for obvious reasons. This is how you see it in your textbooks without the frame. Look at the difference a frame makes. What is a frame? It sets up a place. The painting is then seen through a threshold, through an in-between. The painting doesn't just float in some indeterminate nothing. So I couldn't find a decent image of... Actually, I don't think this painting has a frame. It's actually just sitting on the wall without a frame. So, the iconic quality, the monumental quality, the Byzantine East Roman quality, we can see clearly by comparing this early 9th century mosaic from the Hagia Sophia, which is very pictorially Roman, with our Bellini, where you see it way up there, up in the semidome, and the Bellini. So do you see are you beginning to at least feel the connection? Oh, the colors are not that great. Okay, now one of his panel paintings. Behind is this silk tapestry. There you see one of the folds. It's a darker exposure, shows its more plastic qualities. And on either side, it's known as the Madonna between the two trees, for obvious reasons. And just to remind you, Bellini's context, Leonardo da Vinci, of course, one of his masterpieces in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Now, what is the difference? First of all, Leonardo's giant baby is actually based on a study of actual Italian babies. The babies are very super stylized with Bellini. There you see it in its frame, and it's quite beautiful. You have to go to the Hermitage to see it, and they have the red velvet walls like they should. Again, another contemporary. Definitely more inward, closer to Bellini in religious character is Botticelli, one of my favorites. Again, it makes no sense if you take it away from its frame. Look at it in the context of its frame. This is the best version with the frame. But you see how the Madonna is placed between two frames. The frame of the painting, the frame of the window, the look into the world beyond, which is mostly sky. You take away the frame and you're taking away the sense of the painting. And it needs its original frame. So you have a frame within a frame, and there you have the painting. Now, sadly, okay, the third great contemporary, of course, is Raphael, and he has these sacred conversations. This is his Madonna of Foglio, just the place where it was painted for. It has no frame. When you go to see it in the Vatican Pinacotheki, it's just floating in space. Now, the tradition. Here is somebody trying very hard to be Bellini, a contemporary of his from the early 16th century. You have elements of Bellini, but Bellini is missing from this painting. I hope you can see that. So, yes, the marble work is nicely done. And a very late Bellini, a spectacular painting between St. Christopher with the Christ child. This is Saint Louis of Toulouse, and here we have St. Jerome translating the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into what will become Church Latin, a spectacular composition, just showing Bellini in his 80s still pushing the limits of possibility within a very strict tradition. Sadly, this painting, although it exists in a frame, it's not in its original frame, but at least you can see it within a church in Venice. Again, coloristically, pictorially, quite brilliant. This image dominates, even though it's ostensibly in the middle ground, moving to the background. And when you look much more closely, you can see that they're all operating within a very compressed, sculpturally relief kind of space. And the last painting that we know associated with him is a deposition, and where the landscape and the cross are foregrounded. The Lamentation over the Dead Christ, it was what it's called. It was, and to compare it with the last great painter of international Gothic, of course, is Dürer, the same theme. So Bellini has carved out a very distinct niche for himself between Byzantine international Gothic and the High Renaissance, and it is a synthesis of all the above. Let's just look more closely at the figures. Again, very compressed. I hope you can now see the sculptural relief of the spatial field. An astonishingly beautiful painting. It's in the Accademia. This is it in its frame. That is its frame. It's just hanging on a wall. And that's our lecture for today. Now, next week, Bellini had two great students that were members of his atelier in the last decade of his life, and they are Giorgione and Titian. So they don't come from nowhere. They got a, as it were, a help by emerging out of Bellini's extraordinary trajectory. So. Until next week. Well, the week after, sorry. Next week is your break. The week after. So, give a hand to Bellini. He's one of my favorite painters.